Welcome to the nation's capital. And before you today are a number of work products that folks have created over the last, I'll say, 9 months. What you're looking at are in the folders in front of you are presentations that will be delivered today. In the last month or so, you've received soft copies of the deliverables themselves that will be voted, and there'll be 3 working groups that we'll consider today. One of them we heard from before. 2 we did not. Working Group 1A will present today. Working Group 4A will be reconsidered. We heard that group on back in March, and there was a small change that had to be made, so we'll relook at that this time. And then we'll also be hearing from Working Group 5, and we'll also get shorter readouts from the other working groups today. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it back over to Bill. One is, I also, in addition to the folks in the room, I would like to welcome the folks that are joining us by conference bridge and also on the webinar. So this is being webcast, not the webinar or webcast, either one. I guess it amounts to the same thing. But I'd like to welcome both those sets of folks. Also, when you're speaking, this probably won't be the last time you hear this today, but when you're speaking, please speak into the mics, because otherwise we won't be able to get a transcript or accurate rendition up on the screen. So again, welcome, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. We do have a pretty busy agenda today, and so we'll get into it fairly quickly, but I did want to take the opportunity to kind of remind everyone that October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and given the scope of what we do, I think it's appropriate that we kind of recognize that. We've had a kind of an unprecedented activity that a group of public and private organizations have come together to create a public awareness campaign. It's kind of, I think somebody compared it to some of the other campaigns of being careful with forest fire prevention and other things, but the tagline is stop, think, and connect. And I guess I would say that one of the things that I found a little shocking when I started getting data on our network at AT&T was the number of, not only the number of attacks that we see on a daily basis, but the number of sophisticated attacks that we see on our network on a daily basis. I mean, frankly, I won't share the specifics, but it is remarkable, and I'm thankful that we've got some of the really good security people that we have, and I'm sure every other operator in here has the same thing. But I think it's really appropriate to understand really how critical it is, how many people there are out there that have one objective, and that is to do harm to our network and our customers. And I think it's appropriate, given the scope of this organization, that we recognize this month as National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And I would encourage you to look at the Stop, Think, and Connect campaign and see how you might apply it in your organizations. But with that, we'll get started into the agenda, and I'd like to ask Chris to go through the agenda with us.
Thank you. Good morning. Before we get started, if we could go around the table very quickly, and if you would do a quick introduction so that we know not only who's in the room, and then we'll do a roll call on the phone, and start to my right here.
1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Jeff Goldthorpe, and I'm the DFO for the CSRIC.
I'm Jamie Barnett, and I'm the Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau.
I'm Lauren Kravitz. I'm the new Deputy DFO for the CSRIC.
Good morning, Rich Wolf, ABC Broadcast Operations and Engineering in New York.
Good morning, Alan Turner, National Cable Television Cooperative. I'm the the Vice President of Technology.
Good morning, Maurice Tozay, Telecommunications Systems CEO.
Good morning, Scott Tollefson, formerly General Counsel of USA Mobility.
And Lana Thompson with Public Television Stations.
Morning, John Shantz with Comcast.
Bob Ross, CBS Broadcasting, New York.
David Penn, Assistant Administrator for FEMA.
John Morris, Center for Democracy and Technology.
Ryan Moyer, ETUG.
Kevin McGinnis, National Association of State EMS Officials.
Steve Melfors, Federal Reserve Board.
All right, Dick Lynch, Verizon.
Amador Lucero, Quest Communications.
Rick Kemper, CTIA.
Brett Jenkins, Ion Media Networks.
Chris Hillebrand, T-Mobile.
Jennifer Hightower, Cox Communications.
Lisa Hamlin, Hearing Loss Association of America.
Tom Good, the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions.
Bob Ghiberelli, DirecTV.
Lori Flaherty with the National 911 Program at the Department of Transportation.
James Fager, CenturyLink.
Peter Kim, sitting in for Chris Essa, DHS Office of Emergency Communications.
Craig Donaldson, Intrado.
Doug Davis of Hypercube, representing CompTel.
Jim Corey, Light Squared, representing the Satellite Industry Association.
Turner Clayton, Seminole County Branch, NAACP, Florida.
Lynn Claudy, National Association of Broadcasters.
Leonard Charles, Morgan Murphy Media.
Uma Chandrasekhar, Alcatel-Lucent, representing TIA.
William Brownlow, representing NIPSTEC, National Public Safety Telecommunications Council.
Bob Ozzie, Sprint.
Bill Smith, AT&T.
And Chris Fisher representing APCO. On the telephone, if I could do a roll call, please. Any of you that are on the bridge. Art Prest.
I'm here.
Becky Berger.
Here.
Brian Fonts.
Yes, I'm here.
C. Patrick Roberts.
Here.
Charles Brennan.
Here.
Marcia Brooks.
Good morning.
Good morning. Paul Brenner.
Here.
Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
As we proceed throughout the day, I want to do just a quick overview of our agenda. As we move forward, there will be 3 final reports that are being presented for a vote. Working Group 1A on Public Safety Consolidation. Working Group 4A, which is Best Practices for Reliable 911 and Enhanced 911. And Working Group 5, which is Common Alerting Protocol Introduction. There will be working group readouts on Group 2A, which is Cybersecurity Best Practices. They'll be giving us a midpoint readout, and then we'll be receiving status reports from the remaining work groups. Again, just a reminder, please talk directly into the microphone so that we make sure the folks on the phone bridge can hear. And any of you on the phone bridge, please keep your phones muted until such time that you are going to speak. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the Chief of the FCC Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau, Jamie Barnett.
Chris, thank you so much. And on behalf of the chairman and the commissioners of the FCC, I'd like to add my welcome to you. Thank you for being here, taking time out of your busy schedules. The reason that you're on this is because you're important folks. You represent important organizations and important sectors, and we absolutely rely on that for the work of the CSRIC and really for the work of the FCC. To me, I was talking to Laurie about it earlier on. It actually is a new level of citizenship, both corporate and personal, that I was unaware of before I came to the FCC. It's tremendous work, and I look forward to hearing the reports today, but I really do appreciate your time and expertise. I'd like to give special thanks to Chris Fisher of APCO and to Bill Smith of AT&T for their leadership of the council, and we really do appreciate that as well. And I would also add to that Martha Carter of Caddo Parish, Louisiana, Mike Alanya of Motorola, Brian Fonts of NENA, who was on the phone just now, Peter Musgrove of Addis, Pat Roberts with the Florida Association of Broadcasters, and Damon Penn of FEMA. For their leadership of the working groups that will be presenting reports to CSRIC's consideration today. And thank you for that work. So today, CSRIC will consider reports from 3 of its working groups: the Public Safety Consolidation Group, the Reliable 911 and E911 Working Group, and the Common Alerting Protocol Working Group. I particularly look forward to these. These seem to be very timely to me, and particularly with the actions that you think the FCC should to address these issues. One of those major ones that I'm looking forward to, of course, are the recommendations regarding the Common Alerting Protocol in light of FEMA's adoption of the CAP standard last week and our public notice issued earlier this year seeking stakeholder input on what changes the Commission should make to its EAS rules in light of CAP. I also look forward to hearing the status reports of the other working groups that continue to develop recommendations in various areas. As Bill mentioned, it is Cybersecurity Month, and related to the work of the CSRIC, we need to ensure that all of the good work that we're doing here to improve public safety is protected and as secure from attack as possible. So let me remind everybody that with this, we'll go into it with that increased awareness. I'd like to emphasize the special responsibility that the communications providers have to secure their networks and to help protect their customers from malware. The FCC is joining, as Bill mentioned, the Stop, Think, Connect campaign to support awareness, this Awareness Month, and urging users to learn more about the risks and to protect their networks and themselves. The FCC will be releasing several blogs and tip sheets this month to educate users and provide step-by-step guidance on maintaining the network security. This effort complements the policy work we're doing in cybersecurity, including the Cybersecurity Roadmap, proposing rules to extend outage reporting to broadband ISPs and VoIP providers, exploring a voluntary cybersecurity certification program for communication providers, and a voluntary cybersecurity information reporting system where participants would provide real-time reporting system, real-time information really, and monitoring for major cyber events. We look forward to working with you on all of these and the important initiatives that enhance our work, and we appreciate the CSRIC for doing that. I'd also, while I'm doing thank yous, like to thank, in essence, the FCC staff that supports the work of the CSRIC, including Jeff Goldthorpe and Lauren Kravitz, who is to my right here, Sue Gilgenbach, Jane Kelly, Chantel Virgil, and then the folks that work directly with you on the working groups, the ones that we're reporting today, Jerry Stanshine and Aaron Reich. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but once again, thank you so much for your work.
Okay, thank you for your comments. We appreciate that you're here. And with that, we will begin to work through these working group reports. First up is Working Group 1A, which is a public safety consolidation, best practices and recommendations. The presenters and co-chairs, Martha Carter, the emergency number professional and 911 administrator for Caddo Parish in Louisiana, and Mike Alagna, Director of Homeland Security Strategic Initiatives and Policy with Motorola Global Government Affairs. So they will make their presentation. After the presentation, we'll open the floor for any questions and discussion, and then we will expect to take a vote on this report. So with that, Ms. Carter.
Thank you, Chris. Members of the CSRIC body, FCC representatives. Good morning. As Chris said, my name is Martha Carter, and I'm the director of the Caddo Parish 911 Communications District, which is located in Shreveport, Louisiana. I serve as co-chair of Working Group 1A with Mr. Michael Agna, who is the Director of Homeland Security Strategic Initiatives for Motorola. It's an honor and a privilege to serve on this work group and to be able to present this report to you on behalf of the Working Group 1A members. Working Group 1A's charter was to define the challenges of public safety consolidation efforts and then to develop recommended effective practices to overcoming these challenges. Historically, communication centers, 911 systems were built and operated specifically for single PSAPs or single public safety agencies in mind. Being designed to meet a unique local governmental requirement did lead to incompatibilities sometimes of systems, inefficient use of resources, and higher costs in equipment. However, due to declining budgets, resources, the advances in technology, political pressures, the understanding of importance of interoperability, more and more of our public safety agencies are considering consolidation. I want to talk quickly about our work group's methodology because I think it's important for the CSRIC group to understand how we got to making the recommendations. In an effort to meet the charter, our working group members divided the challenges of public safety consolidation into 3 areas of focus. They were governance, technology, and operations. Then we took each area of focus and then broke them down into specifics, such as under governance, we looked at leadership, we looked at decision-making groups, agreements, funding, and strategic planning. Under technology, we looked at system functionality, system performance, interoperability, and human factors, the impact of technology on the human element. And under operations, we looked at policies, procedures, training, and exercises. Based upon these areas of focus, our work group members jointly developed a list of interview questions to compare and contrast the various consolidation efforts. Our working group members identified agencies which were representative of different types of consolidation efforts, ranging from 911 networks or infrastructure only, to full consolidation of 911 and dispatch operations, to consolidation of communication systems. Our group members' own experiences provided a starting point for our group to go on and identify consolidation efforts from across the country and to seek out representatives who were willing to talk to us about their consolidation efforts. Interviews were conducted and 12 case studies were developed, which have been highlighted within the final report. Additionally, our group took the survey data that was collected through APCO's work of their Consolidated Center Directors Network of over 198 PSAPs or 911 centers that have been through some type of form of consolidation effort, whether it be through PSAP technology or radio communication systems. Next. Oh, okay. Next one, please. Our approach, after collecting the data on each of the communications projects, we analyzed the data and determined what the consolidation drivers were, whether they were political, economical, or service-related. Our members reviewed existing reports, standards, previous recommendations and best practices that were made available by public safety practitioners in the industry. Public safety agencies reported that they were driven to consolidation because of service quality levels, operational concerns, technology obsolescence, and funding. The challenges that were reported by the public safety agencies included transferring of 911 calls between multiple communication centers, difficulty in coordinating multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional responses between different agencies, concerns about sustainable funding, tracking or keeping up with the latest in technology, such as Next Generation 911, land mobile radio, CAD systems, and they were concerned about the ability to keep refreshing and updating communications when they had to deal with replacement in multiple 911 centers. And last but not least, they were concerned about performance and service levels below expectations. The case studies and surveys led our working group members to develop findings, identify effective practices, and ultimately led to the development of the recommendations outlined in the final report. At this point, I'm going to turn the next segment of the briefing over to Mr. Michael Agna, who's going to discuss an overview of our findings and recommendations, and then we'll follow up with a summary and any questions that the board may have. Mike.
Thank you, Martha. I'll start with just a quick overview of the technology environment. That was one of the groups that we had working, and it continues to transition, as this group well knows, from wireless land mobile radio voice systems to 4G data, including mobile computing, from 911 citizen calls to multimedia inputs into next generation solutions. We're going from wireline to IP networks, and from PSAPs to dispatch and integrated command centers. Taking 911 emergency calls, there were 240 million of them annually. That's the latest statistic. 291,000 wireless calls per day. It's estimated that 25% of households currently rely on wireless as their primary service. And just looking at smartphones, year-over-year growth in smartphones is 55%, and they're shipping 270 million converged devices in calendar year 2010. Short messaging services, SMS, 150 billion messages per month in 2009. That is up from 10 billion per month in 2005. So the environment is really moving quickly, and I'll take that as a baseline to get into the next slide and the phases of consolidation, be able to go through some of the findings and recommendations for you. We quickly came to the conclusion there are 6 phases of the consolidation process. Number 1, and most important, is the identification of an effective champion. This person has to be well respected to lead the process. Next was interest building. These things don't happen on their own accord. The decision makers and stakeholders often have to deal with skepticism and potential rejection. It's recommended that a feasibility study be undertaken to help bridge through some of these issues around what are the current services being offered, what makes sense as far as consolidation, and get into some recommendations. The 4th phase is called planning. This is where the decisions are made regarding participation funding, what's the structure, how do you govern it, what are the human resources issues, facility and technology needs. Phase 5 was called implementation and transition. This is where you actually roll out the solution, procurement, installation, training, and construction. Phase 6, and lastly, is the post-consolidation phase. This is where you get into the operation and maintenance portion and where a lot of the service and technology issues come to bear. Next slide, please. The report and overview document we've provided summarizes there are 16 major findings and 44 effective practices that came out of this case study undertaking that Martha described. And we would say that due to the diversity of the consolidation efforts, we found that these strategies are most effectively applied by leaving the specific implementation decisions to the individual participants. The idea of best practices was somewhat of a stretch for us. There's just such a diversity of applications and scope that I think, though, that we've come up with some significant findings and what we call effective practices. Next slide, please. Finding number 1. Successful consolidations require that a trusted and secure governance structure be established. A champion must lead the project, and the political leadership must be in place to support the effort. Not unexpectedly, there will be resistance to consolidate operations, as it might mean fewer jobs and less control for participants. The overriding factor in the decision-making process was that political leaders must objectively determine if consolidation can better serve their citizens, and this should be the major driving factor. Finding number 2, next slide, please. Securing agency buy-in was the next biggest challenge. A primary issue for agencies to overcome is the fear of loss of control and this shared responsibility notion. So agencies need to be convinced that loss of control is more than offset by the benefits of joining a consolidated system. Benefits could be access to technology they could not afford on their own, standardized procedures, and interoperability. Finding number 3, the next slide, please. We found that legislation may be necessary to create a sustainable funding mechanism or codify relationships between the parties. And funding legislation has not kept pace, frankly. Requirements have changed dramatically over the past 20 years, and funding legislation changes have rarely taken into account the additional burdens being placed on 911 centers throughout the United States, especially given consideration of the technology progress that was introduced here. Finding number 4, the need to formalize the arrangement through some sort of legal agreement and to establish strong and clear membership structures. This agreement can take many forms, the most important being that the agreement be clear, well-defined, and should define major responsibilities, expectations, and dispute resolution procedures. Finding number 5, next slide. Personnel issues are difficult and troubling in any consolidation and require a great deal of thought at the policy level early on. The governance model chosen by the partner agencies has the responsibility for creating an organizational culture that enhances the ability of participating entities to succeed. Moving to the next finding, number 6. Well-defined communication channels among stakeholders and the governing body is critical to successful consolidation. Consolidation efforts were often met with seemingly unforeseen challenges. Open communications and frequent discussions to identify and address issues of concern will help to alleviate the perceived threats and problems. Moving to finding number 7. Next slide. Consolidation can produce long-term cost efficiencies by reducing operations and technology duplication. Not all consolidations result in cost savings. The realization of savings may not occur for several years due to capital and other startup costs. Finding number 8. Consolidation results in better trained and more focused workforce, increasing the level of public safety. Consolidation has a positive impact on staff training and professionalism, which improves service level overall, and career path planning for staff aids and employee retention. Finding number 9. The technical infrastructure has become increasingly complex over the last decade, translating into both higher maintenance costs as well as increased training requirements. Next generation features such as NG 911, video, converged voice, messaging data, and video will introduce multimedia to current workflows. And it's not practical to attempt the migration to next generation 911 systems on less than a major metropolitan area. A regional or multi-county state or even multi-state basis is applicable due to economic and overall system operational and management considerations. Finding number 10, interoperating across technologies is critical. Using a common technology platform approach in developing public safety applications and building on a standards-based technology enables common user experiences with meaningful interactions across the multiple applications such as 911, CAD, record management systems, and others, as well as recent trends towards regional, multi-jurisdictional, and multidisciplinary approaches improve day-to-day mission effectiveness and incident response. Finding number 11, share standards-based systems lead to technical, operational, and financial advantages. For example, shared radio systems consolidate the communications of multiple agencies, leading to technical, operational, financial gain. And DHS reports that shared radio systems provide the optimal level of interoperability. Finding number 12, the traditional revenue streams to fund capabilities are not keeping pace with the cost to refresh and maintain technology. As technology has evolved, consumers have migrated from traditional wireline services to new communication services, and developing a sustainable funding mechanism that is separate from the normal appropriation mechanism is needed. Finding number 13, successful implementation of technology is supported by a secure governance structure, is highly dependent on effective operational procedures and consistent training of practitioners. Consolidation is frankly a complex, multidimensional issue that involves a technological, strategic, tactical, and cultural change. Technology is a big hurdle, but experience from the surveys has shown that governance and political issues are harder to solve. Finding number 14, SOPs must be developed, reviewed, and vetted by operations personnel prior to consolidation to ensure they are consistent. Communications center and customers' SOPs may conflict and cause confusion for command and field personnel. Finding number 15, uniform training is required to ensure agencies coordinate training personnel, standards, policies, procedures, and systems. And a heavy burden is placed on the center operation if operators are not trained in all disciplines. And our last finding, number 16, is training among the consolidated agencies should be supplemented with exercises that provide reinforcement and practical firsthand experience in handling disasters and other situations that are not routine. From that, we developed some recommendations, and there are a handful. The working group suggests the Federal Communications Commission consider promoting the development of new funding strategies to assist public safety agencies in their consolidation efforts. Specifically, some ideas for consideration include the FCC work in collaboration with relevant federal agencies to determine if public safety infrastructure projects can be eligible under any new or existing public infrastructure funding programs being considered, such as critical infrastructure key resources, National Infrastructure Bank, and other infrastructure investment programs. The FCC should work with federal agencies and explore developing grant guidance that creates incentives for consolidation efforts. The FCC should also issue a public notice to receive comments on the funding status of public safety answering points, to understand the extent that 911 funds are used for purposes other than 911, as noted in the National Broadband Plan Recommendation 16-14. And to understand the impact of IP-based and multimedia services that will be placed on next-gen PSAPs, as noted in the National Broadband Plan Recommendation 16-15. As a complementary component to existing grant programs, the FCC should also consider creating or recommending a revolving loan fund for public safety system consolidation efforts. Continuing with the recommendations, the FCC should consider the development of concepts of operations, requirements, technical and operational standards to provide a roadmap for public safety agencies as they migrate to next generation solutions. Potentially, this can be considered under recommendation 16-14 of the MBP. The FCC should consider the establishment of a repository of effective practices with respect to policies, practices, procedures, technology, training, and exercises to guide consolidation efforts from lessons learned. The FCC should collaborate with the Department of Homeland Security as it updates the National Emergency Communications Plan for feedback to include new types of technology, to review gaps in the current plan, and to create an updated integrated emergency communications planning strategy. The FCC should issue guidance to agencies contemplating consolidation to undertake a comprehensive study, and we've reviewed some of these, benchmark current services, determine if the consolidation makes sense, and make recommendations for consolidation models, including governance, funding, staffing, technology, and facilities. And wrapping up, the FCC should consider the reevaluation of CSRIC Working Group 1A findings as other working groups present here today in their areas of study. And as described in the charter, the FCC should consider establishing a future work group to consider the findings of this 1A group in addressing longer-term issues, specifically the transition to networks that are owned or operated, at least in part, by non-public safety entities. And just in conclusion and wrapping up, we recognize this was a very large question. The national aspects of consolidation and the diversity implementation strategies made the compilation of best practices very challenging. I think we have some key findings and effective practices worth your attention. And we ask that the CSRIC vote to approve the report findings and recommendations. Thank you, and we're here to take questions.
Okay, are there any questions for the co-chairs?
I have a question on particularly, this is Bob Ozzie from Sprint. Question on your last recommendation. One of the things I was wondering about, this takes it from very much of the PSAP orientation. Was there discussion on the implications for the providers during the course of a consolidation, particularly maybe with the next generation systems? It looks like your last recommendation may be getting a little bit towards that perhaps there's some follow-up work that needs to look at both sides of the equation and identify best practices for carriers if consolidation occurs and that sort of thing. Was that kind of what you're thinking?
Absolutely, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah, we agree with that.
All right.
Okay. Other questions? Comments?
To the chairs, but just in general, the intention of the CSRIC panel, et cetera. I guess years after this session or this panel or this commission closes, what's the measurement? What's going to happen to determine if any of these recommendations were taken or became part of a go-forward process, or is it that there is, or is it that there are these studies and they're on a shelf?
No, thank you. That's a good question. I appreciate it. As a DFO, every year, one of the things that I have to do is to file information about that asks specifically what this group has done, and of those things that have been done and voted out, what have we done anything with? That didn't make any sense, but what have we done about them? Okay, so by law, I have to file every year a report that says here's what we're doing about the things that you're recommending. So we can't ignore them. At least I can't, and I'm sure we take. I know we take them very seriously, and the things that we've asked you to do are very relevant to the things that we're doing. So so I expect that that's sort of a procedural thing that we do, and we will be following up on the recommendations.
Bruce?
If I could add to that, one of the challenges, and I think this is one of the things you're aiming at, how do we establish metrics that actually tie to those recommendations? That will be one of our challenges, but it's one that we're intent on.
Any further comments, questions? Okay.
Chris?
Yes, sorry.
Appropriate time for me to bring up our issue, or
Yes.
should that be delayed? Yes. Okay. For those on the conference bridge, Jim Corey representing the Satellite Industry Association. The association has reviewed your final report, and I know that I emailed to Chris and Jeff one sentence that we would submit. We would like to have the committee consider adding to the report, and that is, I don't know if you've got a copy of your report in front of you, but it would be on page 12. And I didn't know whether you guys could consider, but Chris has about 60 copies of this statement that I don't know whether it needs to be passed out, but on page 12, fifth line, so line 5, after the phrase emergency responder communications, you with me? Okay. We would just like to propose that the following sentence be inserted. Satellites can be used to provide robust voice and data services when mobility is required or when terrestrial networks are damaged.
Copies of that language are coming around right now for you.
Jim, was this provided to the committee? I guess as a chair of the group, I'm concerned that we have a lot of people who work a lot of hard hours to develop the documents that come in here for approval, and I'm a little reluctant to start wordsmithing their work on the fly with non-experts. I mean, as just a procedural matter, I got to tell you, I'm a little troubled with trying to change language on the fly on something that's supposed to be in here to be approved.
Well, I asked ahead of time, and I was told to bring the remarks to the CSRIC today.
Well, this material was provided at the last meeting, and we've had now several months to socialize this with the working committee to try and get this document brought in here ready for approval. And, you know, I don't care for the, and frankly, even my experience, the statement needs a little work, honestly, because I've been through several hurricanes, and there are times when you can't rely even on satellite phones during the midst of an emergency. So I'm very reluctant to do anything that particularly changes the material that came out of the committee on the fly. I mean, I just think procedurally it's not a good precedent for this group to get in. I've sat on several NRICs. I don't remember ever changing the language of a report in the final approval, and I got to tell you, this is troubling to me.
Some feedback from the chairs.
Please.
The report was developed from surveys that were conducted with public safety organizations. So what you're seeing are their thoughts. And then, frankly, that issue didn't come up in our discussions with them in speaking around the consolidation issue specifically. It seems like a reasonable request. If we would have to take it back to the working group and understand how that relates to their intent and give it some further consideration, but I defer to the chair and their approach.
Procedurally, I would rather defer to the working group than to start changing their language on the fly. So we can either vote the report out as is, or we can send it back to the working group to vote out on our next meeting. Any discussion of those options? Yes.
Let me just ask, John Morris at CDT, I mean, just to avoid further delay, I mean, is it possible we could, vote out a report subject to a one-sentence addition on this topic without approving the precise language as the working group, sees fit, or do it by email, by email. I personally don't really care one way or another. I'm just trying to avoid delaying this until March.
Not on my watch would be my answer. I mean, this is too important a work to start loosely modifying language, and this one may not be the most important, but I think we have to have an operating principle here that we come into this organization, we come into these sessions with work done through the working committees. I think it's disrespectful, frankly, to try and change their work on the fly in here. So I would offer that we send it back to the working group, and unfortunately have to delay the final report for consideration of the change.
Mr. Smith?
Oh, yes.
I was a member of this working group here and worked very hard on this report. The report does cover wireless communications. Satellite is a form of wireless communications. The terms used here are very generic, and were put in there for a purpose, to be generic, to not call out any specific type of communication. So therefore, my recommendation to the working group would be to reject this submission.
Other discussion?
Bill?
Yes, Dick.
It seems to me that, Dick Lynch, Verizon, it seems to me that you're giving the working group an opportunity to make the decision as to whether to reject it or to take it back and consider it. And I really think we ought to leave it to the two people standing behind me to make that call for the group.
Suggestion.
As chair of the working group, we based our findings on case studies, interviews, and this work product came from the working group. Because we didn't have the benefit of seeing the language prior to today, it does put us at a disadvantage to be able to say, yes, we can accept it. I would prefer, because it is a change to their work product, that we get an opportunity to get the language, we can do it very quickly and report back. I do hate to delay the process, but I do think because we had 36 individuals working on this work group, that this is their work product. And even though the language seems very benign, I do think that because we are taking their interviews, their survey data, and making a change, that the group needs to understand that we reported this based upon interviews from across the country. This was not an issue that was specifically brought up to specify satellite. So that would be my preference as the chair of the work group to take it back. Now, I defer to this group on procedure-wise, how do we proceed from here? If our group decides to reject it versus if our group decides to accept it, what is our next steps for our work group?
I guess my comment would be in line with Bill's. Was the intent, as you put the language together, to be generic enough that you're looking at wireless very broadly as opposed to being very specific about different wireless technologies? And if that's the case, then I would say this would already be included while not specified. And if you start specifying one, do you have to go back and then begin to be very specific about the others? So I guess my question is, was the intent to be generic? And from your perspective, does it include this issue of satellite in your comments?
The intent was to incorporate any potential future technology without specifically naming it, because we had referenced Next Generation 911. We don't know what it's going to look like. We talked about wireless. We talked about it in the realm of future technology. So we left generic language. This gentleman's response was very specific. So our intent was to be generic as we move forward, looking at future technology.
Based on the comments of the chairs, I would like to see how many of you feel comfortable voting it out at this point in time and accepting the work group report as presented. Is that how we do it?
Let's go ahead.
Simple majority. It appears we have a majority of the members around the table willing to accept the report as presented, so that's exactly what. Oh, and on the phone, a couple of things. Ingrid Caples is on the phone. We missed her name. Ingrid, I apologize. You're still there, yes?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. So on the phone, we'll go through your vote. Do you agree to vote out the report, Art? Art Crest, are you still there?
Yes.
Your vote, please.
Yes. Vote out the report.
Okay. Becky Berger?
Yes, vote out the report.
Brian Fonts?
Vote out the report.
C. Patrick Roberts?
Yes, vote it out.
Charles Brennan?
Yes, vote it out.
Marcia Brooks?
Yes, vote it out.
Paul Brenner?
I agree. Vote out the report.
Okay. And Ingrid?
Yes, vote out the report.
Okay. I would say based on the feedback that we will accept the findings of work group 1A. We thank you very much for your work. Being an executive director of a newly consolidated comm center, this is pretty near and dear to me, and feel some of the pain that came through in the case studies and the information, and I applaud you for the work that you did, and the members of your committee, if you would share with them how much we appreciate your work effort, and we thank you very much.
Our next order of business is to look at the report of Working Group 4A, Best Practices for Reliable 911 and E911. And I believe Brian Fonts, the CEO of National Emergency Numbering Association, is going to present that material. Brian?
Good morning. Also, I believe Craig Donaldson is here, and Craig should be able to move any slides and provide any business comments that he has. In 4A, we will be first work to make a presentation in March, as we have indicated at the beginning of today's meeting. We received
Brian?
Yes?
Brian?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we can't understand you. You're very garbled.
Oh dear. Okay, is this better?
That's somewhat better. We'll give that a trot.
I think someone has the webcast going that is somewhat delayed from the conference bridge, and so we're getting a lot of feedback.
Yes, that's a good suggestion. Please, other than Brian, if you would, please make sure you have your phone's muted. And Brian, in your case, it's probably even more important that you mute anything if you have the webcast going.
Yeah, I don't have the webcast on, and I too am getting some feedback from the webcast as well.
You're better now, much better than you were a moment ago. Let's try it again.
Well, thank you. I apologize for having to do this via conference bridge. But first off, I just wanted to note that Craig Donaldson from Entrado, who's a member of Working Group 4A, has the slide deck, I believe, and will be able to provide any additional help and assistance to me while we're going through this presentation. And I appreciate Craig being there. First off, Working Group 4A, as Jeff had indicated, completed its work in March, and I believe we were the first group to report out at our meeting back in the spring. The purpose of Working Group 4A, the objectives clearly were to investigate and identify and compile currently available industry standards and best practices concerning the implementation of 911 and E911 for interconnected VoIP services, and to identify gaps that needed to be addressed and identify the appropriate working group to address those gaps. So the work of 4A was in large part to provide information to other working groups within CSRIC, and those working groups have been working on our recommendations that we presented to CSRIC back in March. As background, for those of you who could remember back to the legislation that was really kind of the governing mechanism for the work of 4A, identifying specific areas where work needed to be done to develop the best practices, was pretty much designed in response to the new and emerging technologies 911 Improvement Act, and requiring the FCC under that act to develop best practices related to the implementation of IP-enabled voice service providers. And the act identified, as I said earlier, 6 specific areas: defining geographic coverage area for public safety answering points, defining network diversity requirements for the delivery of IP-enabled 911 and enhanced 911 calls, call handling in the event of call overflow or network outages, public safety answering point certification and testing requirements, validation procedures for inputting and updating location information in relevant databases, the format for delivering address information to public safety answering points. Now, each of these areas was examined with respect to the standards that exist, best practices, related documents, gaps, and recommendations. And by recommendations, these are recommendations primarily to the working groups within CSRIC that should examine these specific gaps and other information developed by Working Group 4A. And the report that you have before you goes through each of these 6 areas defined in the Act with respect to those specific issues relating to the standards, best practices, related documents, gaps, and recommendations. And in addition to the statute defining the 6 areas, there were a couple of additional areas that Working Group 4A had identified, and this include routing and network reliability, areas that needed additional attention, and data and service reliability areas also need of additional attention. Now, since March, we did in fact implement the recommendations by delivering this information to the respective working groups, and the working groups have been moving forward not only based on the recommendation we provided to them, but others that they would have to consider within the purview of their respective working groups. So in essence, that is the report, a summary of what we've actually done back in March, and to jumpstart the work of some of these working groups that'll be providing reports later on. One final thing, I just want to thank Peter Musgrove for his assistance as co-chair of this working group. And the final slide in the deck are really the people who did the heavy lifting here, the dedicated members of the working group who participated extensively early on in the formulation of CSRIC and Working Group 4A to ensure that product was available for the other working groups to address as we move through this process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of CSRIC.
Thank you, Brian. Let me ask if there are any questions or comments from the floor here. Jim.
Just the messenger.
Understood.
Jim Corey from the Satellite Industry Association. Brian, on page 7 of your final report, in section 5.1, line 2, it starts out, must have a jurisdictional service boundary in order for originating service providers, parentheses open, wireline, wireless, VoIP, parentheses closed. Satellite Industry Association would like to recommend the addition of just 4 words, and that is and mobile satellite services after that wireline, wireless, VoIP. In this particular case, you are specifying technologies, and I think that satellite services have been overlooked. If we're going to be overlooked, maybe we can get an exemption from our E911 compliance. I'm kidding.
Jim,
I'm kidding.
I'm here on page 7. I'm sorry. Could you direct me again to where that is?
I guess,
5.
Brian, hold on a minute. I guess I have the same concern, folks, that I did before of modifying language on the fly. And I think the previous document addressed wireless, and the determination was that wireless was not specific to TDMA or CDMA or LTE or what spectrum it ran in. It was a broad general version referring to wireless. So, Brian, would the intent of the group here, the reference to wireless, include wireless satellite technology?
Yeah, I think in the broad context of wireless writ large, you'd have to look at anything that's delivered by wireless.
So I would ask Jim if you could take that, understand the concern, but you know, I really don't want to start trying to change working group language in here.
Where does VoIP fit in there? Is
And
it delivered
Jim,
either wirelessly or by wireline?
I'm going to ask a question on working group 4B about that, actually, because I think there's, you know, some of the working group 4A work specifically said it does not address VoIP in a wireless environment. And so the question in my mind is, are we capturing that somewhere else? But we'll get to that one a little later on.
and Jim, Corey, I just have a quick question. Since many of our recommendations of 4A have been directed to other working groups, have you been raising this issue with other working groups?
I didn't hear the question.
The question, Jim, was since a lot of this work is directed to hand off issues to other working groups, have you worked with any of those other working groups that some of these concerns might be addressed at that point?
I'm working with whatever product I'm able to review.
Okay.
My comment to all the working groups, because I can't be on all the working groups, I'm the sole representative from the satellite industry, is that in all of your work, you consider the fact that satellite is a form of communications, and I think that in a cellular, LMR, wireline-centric world, many times satellite is overlooked when in fact every one of those industries is it probably has some piece of satellite incorporated into their networks. You know, in this particular case, you know, VoIP is listed, it sticks out. You know, I'd have said wireline and wireless if we're going to apply the same. If you don't want satellite in there, then why is VoIP there, would be my comment. So I understand what you're saying. I'm just representing the industry. The industry has reviewed this information and has offered some suggestions. It was in no way a deal breaker. I was specifically told that if nobody approved the language, I was still vote to approve the documents. But it seems like an appropriate place for the word satellite to exist when these technologies have been. And I just don't know how many people, when they are referred to wireless communications, necessarily think of satellite. I think satellite is very often separated from traditional wireless services.
Understood. Craig, did you have a?
Yeah. Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't mean to speak in your place because you're on the call, but no, I wanted to confirm a couple of things. What Bill said is true. 4A did not specifically refer to VoIP in a wireless type environment, but having been a part of 4B discussions, we have talked about converged services and VoIP, wireless VoIP, being a part of that working group's discussion. So I think it may be fair going forward if we are more clear in the reports. When we talk about wireless, we could say something about it includes a wider array of services, radio spectrum services. So I think it's a fair comment from the satellite industry, but I think that Bill's approach procedurally is probably the right one for the reasons that we've stated.
And I agree with you very much, Craig, and that's why I asked the question if these issues were being brought up within the working group, which 4A had made recommendations to address these issues. And I think overall, you know, in the cover language that goes with the report, terminology could be addressed at that point too, in terms of wireless inclusions of, and list the wireless forms of communication at that point.
Well, Jim, yes, question.
I guess the comment about VoIP being mentioned, I look at VoIP is more of a protocol related versus a transport mechanism. You know, be it satellite, be it wireline, be it internet. It's apples and oranges.
Yeah, you know, this is probably, you know, not the place to debate the details, but there are some unique issues around VoIP services and the fact that they're inherently non-geographic that I think really requires some special attention here. But But Jim, I think you've raised an excellent point, and I think the comments here hopefully have heightened awareness of all the working groups to address those issues. I'd like to see if there are any more comments or questions on this report, and if not, we'll take it to vote. I don't see any questions in the room, so let me say all in favor of the report being approved. On the phone, any opposed only? Okay, the report is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to Working Group 5, which is the Common Alerting Protocol Introduction. Our presenter today is Damon Penn, the Assistant Administrator with FEMA National Continuity Programs. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. And the first thing I'll do is take note of a lesson I learned from Jamie, and that's wear your glasses when you do a presentation. So, so we'll get started. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. And thank you for all the help throughout the 6-month period that we've been working on the working group from everybody here. And I'd also like to recognize Pat Roberts as the co-chair from the Florida Association of Broadcasters and all the leadership and hard work that he put in, as well as all the time that the 22 full-time members and the dozens of part-time members and subject matter experts that participated in the process were able to give us. Here's a quick agenda, and we'll run through this. I realize this is a briefing, so we will be brief. Next, please. And this just outlines our charter. What we're really tasked to do is provide recommendations on the OASIS published CAP 1.2 and to include specific recommendations regarding rule changes and provide general comments and analysis regarding Part 11 regulatory structure for a CAP-based EAS. And you might ask why this is important. There are a growing number of existing state and local IP-based EAS networks across the United States, many of which already utilize a CAP data format, as well as numerous local jurisdictions with their own CAP and EAS systems and pilots. A survey conducted by the Texas Association of Broadcasters revealed that at least 18 states in the District of Columbia are already originating and disseminating CAP messages. So the time to implement our procedures is now, and we hope that as a result of the effort of our committee that we'll accept the final report for your we'll present this report for your consideration. Quickly, our methodology. Again, we had 22 subject matter experts full-time and about 24 other part-time subject matter experts that came on board to assist us. What we found was in order to maximize our effectiveness, we needed to break down into 2 subgroups. One focused on the technical aspects and the Part 11 rulemaking, and the other focused on policy and how to deal with the disabilities community and how to fully integrate them into what we were doing. So from that, our findings. And as we work our way through, what you'll see are really 5 procedural findings and then 33 technical findings and recommendations for clarification and verbiage of existing Part 11 rulemaking that we're recommending to the committee. So first, the general procedural parts here, as listed, we discussed and looked into the implementation guidelines that currently exist and found that those were acceptable. We looked at how the states would disseminate messages and what's important to them. And one of the findings was that the governors currently do not have a must-carry tied to state-level messages. So some discussions there about how governors should be able to convey messages and whether or not those messages needed to be as a must-carry. And our finding was that those do need to be a must-carry. EAS participation and a requirement to be monitored by IP-based CAP resources. EAS equipment tables that need to be revised to reflect what's the new CAP and EAS protocols, and then Ethernet input over IP sources. So as you look through the next 5 slides, I really just want to go through those quickly. I'm sure you've had a chance to look at them in detail, but these next 5 slides really outline the details of the 5 broad-based findings that I just highlighted earlier. So these are the background for those 5. So from there, I'd like to present the following 5 recommendations for consideration. First, adherence to the CAP standard alone does not guarantee that the connected systems and equipment will be conformant with Part 11 rules for EAS activation and display. This would likely present compatibility and interoperability issues for IPAWS at the federal level and for the state, local, and territorial CAP EAS systems. CAP is a general data format and emergency messaging all hazards and warning system. The intent of CAP was to allow a consistent warning message to be disseminated simultaneously over different warning systems, thus creating warning effectiveness and simplifying the warning task. EAS implementation guide details how that receiving device should interpret a CAP formatted message and constructs the 47 CFR Part 11 message and associated audio and text data. In May of 2010, the EAS CAP Industry Group published the implementation guide intended to further reduce the areas of uncertainty in how the alert and presentation of the public CAP EAS would be generated and disseminated. And we think that implementation guide provides the specific details needed on how to send and receive a message. So our recommendation is that the FCC accept that guide and we use that implementation guide to finalize the governing rules and make sure we have EAS that accommodates CAP. Also, we had a long discussion on the current 180-day rule for compliance by the broadcast industry. And the recommendation of the committee was to ask the FCC to relook this and consider extending it from 180 days to 360 days. And there is a mistake in the report. In the initial part of the report, it refers to 300 days, and at the end it refers to 360 days. The 300 days is a typo. The real number is 360. Next, state and local governments. More than 14,000 broadcast stations and 10,000 cable systems across the nation are required to follow their state EAS plans, as well as local EAS plans in many cases. Each state's plans specify the monitoring for all broadcast stations and cable stations within that state. These plans and monitoring assignments will need to be updated to accommodate CAP EAS systems. Several states are known to be currently updating their state EAS plans to reflect current or planned CAP EAS origination and distribution capabilities. However, in most states and local areas have not yet filed updated EAS plans to reflect the usage of the next generation of CAP-based capabilities. So from that, the group recommends that the FCC dictate that the states adopt the CAP format and determine what a timely fashion should be and what kind of guidelines we should provide to the state for when they should come into compliance. A national relay system. As more and more people with disabilities transition from traditional wireline phone systems and TTY usage to the internet-based technologies as their primary means of communications, it's important that these platforms continue to facilitate the delivery of emergency messages to citizens with disabilities. This could be achieved through the development of a national relay center which disabled individuals could contact to learn more about local events after receiving an initial alert through traditional channels. Such a center should be a source of information for the deaf and hard of hearing, the blind and visually impaired, caregivers in group homes, and people with disabilities. Secondly, deployment of CMAS at the local, state, tribal, and federal level using a CAP interface to the federal alert aggregator and the CMAS architecture should be adopted. Our next recommendation concerns our multilingual community. The multilingual population in the United States is continuing to grow in size, and according to census data, among the 262 million people aged between 5 and 47, or between 5 and over, 47 million or 18% speak languages other than English. U.S. Census documented over 300 different languages and language categories that are spoken here in the United States, with the most predominant being Spanish, which comprises about 15% of our population. After considering several sources of information throughout, the working group found that there are considerable challenges to adequately address the multilingual emergency messaging needs for the changing population. Key among those challenges is a large number of different languages that might need to be accommodated, geographical variances in which languages are spoken, as well as a lack of available technology to support effective automated multilingual translation. So working group concluded that at this time, the choice of language and which language to use in a multilingual EAS message is best determined by the entities that control specific communities, because the local communities know which languages are spoken and which languages that they have to comply with. So our recommendation is that message translation at this time be the responsibility, should not lie with the originator, but should be the responsibility of the local receiver to translate. And we also recommended several other places where we could find more information and continue to work on our technologies and our ability to service our multilingual communities. One of which was to seek other countries and the work they're doing, particularly in Canada and Israel. They have some very robust programs. Research reliability of machine or software-based translation technology. And then while CAP does support the capability for multiple languages and in many different dissemination messages, message formats today, CAP itself is not a delivered end user. So some more research also needs to be done into how multi-language information would be delivered to the end users. So as a conclusion, our findings show that many portions of Part 11 will need some modification, and we've recommended those specific modifications in some detail. We think the implementation guide is a great tool to help do that, and we ask that you consider our report as is with the recommendations that we make. Are there any questions or anything I can clarify for anyone? Yes, sir.
Lynn Claudia with the National Association of Broadcasters. I just have a request for what I believe is an editorial change in the report language, having to do with the recommendation for extending the timeline for EAS participants to adopt CAP. Because that's a significant recommendation to the FCC, and in light of the FEMA announcement several days ago, that recommendation for extension should be exceedingly clear to anyone reading the report. But I believe even with the amendment that you made, changing 300 to 360, that it is stated slightly differently in several parts of the report, and it would be good to conform them. Specifically, the recommendation on paragraph 1156 says the recommendation is to extend the 180-day clock to be no less than 1 year. However, in the executive summary and in the PowerPoint here, even with the amendment from 300 to 360, it says extend the timeline from 180 days to 360 days. A plain reading of that text could have two interpretations. One is take the 180 days and make it 360 days. The other would be extend it another 180 days to 360 days. And in any case, the minor precision point of the difference between 1 year and 360 days, there just seems the opportunity for confusion. There's no reason to open that door. So I would ask the committee to consider changing the language to conform to the exact recommendation that you have stated from the lectern.
Okay, and I think as the co-chair of the subcommittee that I can commit us to clarifying the language. The intent of the recommendation is 360 days, and we can certainly make that clear in the final report so that it's consistent throughout. But the recommendation is 360 days. Thank you.
Comments?
Just a question on the Relay Center recommendation. Was the working group contemplating extending the responsibilities and capabilities of the existing TRS centers, or actually a second similar or parallel type center, or is it just kind of
yeah, it was the recommendations really for a second parallel type center, okay, with a very narrow focus.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa Hamlin from Hearing Loss Association. Just to follow up on that, just as a point of clarification, were you envisioning the relay centers? It says here as a source of information, so if somebody's deaf, they call in and they find out what's happening, or did you envision it as a relay center where somebody calls in an emergency of any sort and has their voice, has their emergency relayed to a hearing person?
No, the concept really is that especially with the limitations of the emergency alert messages, that a general message be sent out to the disabled community that says there has been an emergency, please call this alert center and get the clarification. Then they would be able to call the center and be able to find out in a language that they understood what the exact emergency was, or in a format that they could receive get the exact details on what the emergency was.
So to follow up on that, it's not actually a relay center. It's an information center for people who are deaf or hard of hearing or speech impaired.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yes, it will not generate or relay another message.
Right.
It doesn't relay. It doesn't take for clarification.
Right. It doesn't take somebody who's deaf and allow them to speak to somebody who's hearing.
Right.
Are there comments for consideration by the work group before we take a vote on this? Okay. With the change, as you noted, to the 300 to the, or 180 to 300 and the issue of the year, I think you should have editorial privilege to make those changes. And with those changes included, I'd like to see hands. All in favor of voting the report out, please. I meant 300. No, I meant 300 to 360.
Right.
Right. Yes, yes, my mistake. 300 to 360, right? Okay. All in favor then? Okay. On the telephone, anyone not support reporting this or voting this out? Okay. Thank you very much for your work.
We've had 3 very significant reports approved today, and I think we should all, again, thank the committees for all the hard work that have gone into those. That's a significant step forward for this organization, and you know, I think it's something we should all take a moment and recognize and be proud of. Now we'll move on into the updates of the other working groups who have not yet got their deliverables ready for the group, but are many of which are coming up pretty closely on their deliverable deadline. So first of all, I would like to go to Working Group 2A, Cybersecurity Best Practices, excuse me, and the presenter will be Gary Toretti with AT&T.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Gary Toretti.
Gary, are you on the phone?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great.
This is Gary Toretti with AT&T representing Working Group 2A, and our group is the cybersecurity best practices overall. We have approximately 30 people representing 22 organizations that are participating on this work group subcommittee. If you take a look at slide 2, what we've done is we've taken the cybersecurity best practices and we've broken this down into 5 verticals and 4 horizontals. As you can see, we've got the wireless IP services, network, people, and legacy services across the top, and identity management, encryption, vulnerability management down on the left-hand side. We've taken each of these subgroups that exist out there and we've broken them down into various topics, and as you can see, the topics are listed there. So if we take a look at wireless specifically, you can see we're looking at the mobile handsets, the Wi-Fi network, we're looking at 3G, 4G from a cellular standpoint, emerging devices like femtocells, and the microwave and satellite group that's out there also. We've done that across the board for each of the subgroups, breaking them down specifically into key areas overall. This gives you an idea of the complexity that goes along with this. Each of these subject areas, we've related this information back to the NRIC 7 document that came out, I believe, in the 2005 timeframe. We've looked at related areas that exist out in the internet space today. We've looked at the best practices that exist within each of the companies that are out there today also. And the group is gone through at this point and is drafting their recommendations and also looking at any gaps that may exist out there that need to be closed at this point. We go on to slide 3. It just gives you some background. The group is meeting monthly. Our subgroups are meeting both weekly or bi-weekly throughout the process. We have the various subgroups broken out, as I mentioned, by the subtopics themselves. And at this point, since the March time frame, what I've targeted is for the group to have their rough draft into the process here by the end of the August time frame, and looking to firm up that rough draft by the November 12th time frame. Since I put this slide deck together last week, I am now at 6 of 9 subgroups have provided their rough draft to me. I've asked for spreadsheets to show comparisons back to the NRIC document and also document where they're getting their information from for their best practices overall. And so we've got those documents, and we've also got the summary documents that each of the subgroups are providing also. So at this point, our next steps will be to actually start taking that information, reviewing it, providing feedback back to each of the subgroups to get it firmed up so we could have everybody submit their best practices by the November 12th time frame. Action items, really, the only group that we got a late start with is our encryption subgroup. Initially, just trying to get enough members, getting leadership in that group. It took several months behind the other groups. I believe we got a late start. It was probably the August time frame instead of the March time frame as we did with the other groups. But I've talked to that leader of that subgroup, and he's well aware of the time frames and feels that getting the information together by the end of this year should not be a problem overall. We go to the last slide. Really, I'm looking to get the remaining of the rough drafts together to get those in as quickly as possible, provide feedback back to the folks overall, and then to work with the team to firm up those rough drafts, get everything finalized by the November 12th time frame. We'll begin drafting our overview documents. I'm looking to complete that by the 15th of January. We have a deliverable to the steering committee by the 31st of January, and then our final report out to all the members will be February 10th, 2011. So at this point, we're on track. Things are progressing nicely. The groups are working well together, and a lot of good information is coming in for cybersecurity best practices. that's my report.
Thanks, Jerry. You do call out one point of an open co-chair position in the encryption subgroup, so I assume that this would be a good opportunity to ask anyone who would like to step up and provide some resource. There's an opportunity to do so.
Bill, since I put these slides together, that position has also been filled too.
That's excellent. Glad to hear that. Any questions or comments for this group? Okay, Chris.
Okay. We'll be receiving now status updates from the remaining work groups. After each presentation, we will certainly open the floor for any questions or comments. We'll start with Working Group 2B, which is Media Security Reliability Council Best Practices Update. Their final report is scheduled to be due the 3rd of March in 2011, and our presenter is Robert Ross, Senior VP East Coast Operations, CBS Broadcasting.
Thank you very much. We've met a number of times in subgroups. These documents are centered around television, radio, cable, and satellite. We had one meeting in person here in Washington last month, and I expect we could stop.
Speak into the mic.
Hello, hello. Not close enough, I guess. It's always the TV guys, not the radio guys. It's always audio. Sorry. Just go back again. We're updating the documents that were generated in the MSRC. They center around television, radio, cable, and satellite, and bringing them up to date. We've had a number of individual meetings around those groups, and we have met in person in Washington once, and I expect we will have deliverables for the spring meeting, and they'll all be updated.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments on this work group's work effort to date? Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Next, we'll move to Working Group 4B, Transition to Next Generation 911, and the presenter is Lori Flaherty with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Lori?
Good morning, and thank you. I'm reporting for Brian Fonts and myself, who have served as the co-chairs of this working group on behalf of the folks who have done the heavy lifting. The amount of work that these folks have put in on, mostly on their own dime and their own time, has been really impressive. So I would like to acknowledge that at the outset. There's just one slide that we have to present the information as an update for our working group. We have divided our work into 4 subgroups. Those 4 subgroups are technology, operations, funding, and access issues. And those 4 subgroups have been meeting. They've accelerated their meeting to weekly meetings in order to meet our deadlines. We have continued to, the subgroup leads for those 4 subgroups have met with the co-chairs on a monthly basis just to make sure our efforts are coordinated, and that continues. And speaking just in terms of what this group can expect, in terms of the timeline, all 4 groups will hand in a draft of their report on November 1st. Between November and the holidays, we plan to consolidate those reports, move them through the Working Group 4B for revisions and for a vote. That report will be ready for the steering committee in January, and we should be well on track to meet our deadline for a final report in March. One comment, we'd be happy to accommodate or a clarification of wireless, whether it's in the text or in a glossary or whatever seems to be most appropriate, and perhaps that's something we could consider for the CSRIC reports at large is some type of glossary or definitions that would be consistently used throughout the document.
Thank you. I was pleased to see the 2A report had satellite address within a context of wireless. I think that's a good takeaway from the discussion. If I may ask one question, the comment that came up earlier, when we have, I know some of the material I read on 4A specifically kind of excluded VoIP in a mobile environment, and I just wanted, it kind of made me think, is 4B explicitly looking at VoIP, for example, any of the number of VoIP clients running on a mobile handset as a part of the scope of work?
Yes, and those of you who are part of the, particularly the technology group, feel free to chime in, but having sat in on those calls, that the technology group is definitely discussing those issues.
Wonderful, thank you. Any questions or comments? Well, thank you so much.
Okay, our next working group report out is 4C, and that's technical options for enhanced 911 location accuracy. Final report will be due at our meeting in December. Our presenter today is Stephen Wisely, Director of Com Center 911 Services for APCO International. There he is. Oh, there you are. I was afraid I was going to have to do it.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of my co-chair, Craig Frost, I'd like to give you a brief 6-slide or thereabouts presentation of where 4C is. Just to give you a little background about how busy the group has been, the full group has had 20 conference calls to date, and frankly, some of the members have been challenged to actively participate on a regular basis due to other CSRIC work group responsibilities, and I use it to describe it as the gene pool sometimes is kind of small on some of the technology folks. So we've had the opportunities to even have a face-to-face are somewhat limited and not practical due to financial constraints of the public safety members. We did, in fact, divide into 2 subgroups and 1 review team. And the 1 subgroup is a service type, and the application subgroup, they've to date had 9 conference calls. They've identified 20 different service types and have variations of descriptions and that will require location for 911 services. So the service type is a very technically oriented, and they're diligently working at their project. The next group is the location technology subgroup, and this group has had 15 different calls and have had roughly 5 different technologies that have been deployed for 911 that they're looking at, and they probably got another 6 emerging technologies which could possibly be used to provide a 911 location fix, so that they are working at this part of the task. We also took a look and had a little review team. Some might be familiar with the location accuracy project that was done called Project Red in California. This had really to do with the wireless. So we've had a small review team looking at this input, and to date they've had 3 calls, and they're working to see how the empirical data can be used within the charter of our 4C subgroup. The next slide will talk about the action items, and 4C has no closed items to date. And the open items that you can see in front of you are pretty much the bullet points that we were given as part of our charter. And I don't think I have to read them all for you. They were there to begin with. But it goes without saying that we have a considerable number of open items that the groups are coming together and getting their information. We go to the next slide. The 2 prime subgroups are now in the midst of merging some of their reports together. And the draft report is, in fact, being formatted, and we're starting to populate it. And if we go to the next slide, it does talk about, we did get also some referrals from Workgroup 4B. We're now working on them within the last week. Those were given to the 4C, and they're being reviewed. Next week, in terms of progress report, which I think you're interested in, we'll be meeting in the first face-to-face, the co-chair, the leader of the team that's going to do the formatting of the report, and the 2 subgroup leaders will be sitting down for a day and a half, starting to get our report together. We have scheduled in November a 2-day or day-and-a-half session where all the members of the work group from 4C have been invited to a report drafting session. Both of these will be hosted in Charlotte, North Carolina, and by one of the public safety members of the work group 4C. So work is progressing. We have found that there's a considerable amount of work here, much more work than we might have thought under the original when we first started this. To do justice to the report, we have late last week requested a 2-month extension for the target dates in order to complete the work. Some discussion had been put forth about, could we do a partial report? Could we do some draft? But the members of the work group, and with given the challenges that they face, requested this additional 2 months so that we can have a good comprehensive report that will do justice to the charter of the 4C work group. And if anybody has any questions.
Looks like none. Thank you so much.
Next, we'll move to Working Group 6, Best Practice Implementation. The presenter will be Stacy Hartman, Director of Public Policy with Quest. Stacy?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to provide our status report to you and open certainly any questions or thoughts throughout the presentation or at the end if you have any. On behalf of Steve Malfris and I, the co-chairs of this best practice working group, I'll provide the next readout. Slide number 2, please. Now this one is just our high-level description of our working group, and I'm not going to read that to you. I'll give the Cliff Notes version. Essentially, we've been tasked with reviewing over 800 best practices, which in and of itself is a pretty onerous task, if you will. In addition to that, we have the opportunity to actually go through the best practices and determine which of that subset is considered vital, and then determining some recommendations as to how to actually measure implementation of those vital best practices. Slide number 3 is a listing of the participants on our working group. As you can see, we have about 20 organizations represented, 25 active participants. Slide 4 is kind of a snapshot of our first deliverable. Kind of the status we've broken it down into is the overall review of the best practices. We broke into 4 separate subcommittees. Each one looked at essentially 200 best practices. We focused on cybersecurity, disaster emergency business continuity, E911, network reliability, and physical security. You'll see listed to each of those the exact number of best practices that were related. Our subcommittee chairs for each team were identified and met weekly with their teams to outline all of the best practices. We reviewed them individually. It was a very manual process, if you will, to review them, to determine kind of how to rate and rank them. Our whole working group pretty much established up front that we needed some criteria to actually get through this review, because we wanted to make sure to be level set across the board and make sure that we were defining essentially what was critical, highly important, or important in the same manner and fashion. So once that was kind of identified, and we'll highlight all that in our final report for everybody, we went through and we did a ranking of each best practice individually to determine which category they fit into. Each of our subcommittees have documented their first deliverables, and we're in the process of integrating those into our draft report. As well, then, we are moving forward with our second deliverable, which is how we actually develop recommendations about measuring implementation of these best practices. We've had some really good discussion and some general, setting of the direction. At this point, we're going to develop 2 more subcommittees. Brand new committee chairs have been assigned, and we'll be working through the process of looking at an education plan to highlight the importance of best practices, as well as developing potential framework for an implementation survey of some sort to really measure how well these vital best practices are actually being implemented by our companies. In addition to that, you'll see on this slide that our working group description has been expanded to include the review of approximately 23, Network Reliability Steering Committee best practices that were either proposed for modification or brand new best practices. We will be taking some time to walk through those and determining whether or not we should be recommending those best practices to this council for acceptance. Next slide, please. Slide 6 is the project timeline. I know the writing is probably small for those of you looking at the screen. Just a couple of key time frames. We did, as I said, get through the first deliverable, and we've integrated that into the report, and we're kind of massaging that right now. We will be meeting today after this council meeting for a face-to-face meeting with a good majority of our team is actually in the room or will be participating. We'll be meeting over at the Federal Reserve today and half of the day tomorrow. We are aiming to have all of the second deliverable work done by the end of November and to begin integration into our final report, and believe that we're well on track for meeting our time frame of January 31st to getting that turned over to the steering committee. Slide 7 is a listing of our action items. You'll see the closed item is obviously the first deliverable I just talked through, and then the open items are the second deliverable and getting through the task of identifying how to measure implementation. We have to finalize our working group report, and then certainly where we've recognized some gaps or recommended modifications for best practices and they're applicable to the other working groups, we'll liaise those over to you for consideration. And then finally, slide 8 on our meeting schedule. You'll see here that our full working group has been meeting virtually on a monthly basis. Our subcommittee teams have generally met on a weekly basis, granted with some work constraints. Sometimes it's a bi-weekly. We do meet on a monthly basis as well with the co-chairs and our subcommittee chairs to make sure that we're really touching base and informed about the work that they've been accomplishing in their teams and that we're assisting where they need for us to do so. We will be having our next virtual meeting on Thursday, October 21st for the full working group, and our next subcommittee lead chair meeting is on November 11th. With our new co-chairs for our next subcommittees just now in place, we'll be establishing kind of the time frame for their meeting reports this afternoon. So are there questions or anything from the floor?
Any questions regarding working group 6?
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, work group 7, pandemic planning, priority service requirements. They're anticipating their final report in December of 2010. Our presenter today is Ingrid Capels, Technology Officer, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And Ingrid, I believe you're still on the phone.
Yes, I am. Thank you, and I co-chair this group with Jerry Wade from Sprint. And the working group description is under a pandemic event scenario. Working group 7 is to address NGN IP priority service requirements. Priority services are essential to communications for the NSEP community, and is incumbent that network operators develop NSEP priority services for the next generation IP-based networks. The WG7 task deliverables are primarily to develop an NGN IP priority services requirements document that specifies the users, types of services, numbers of levels of priorities, processes, much of which already exists underneath the current priority structure. We're also to develop a priority services implementation strategy, the types of service to be rolled out first, etc. These deliverables will be appendixes to their final report along with other supporting documentation. Our current events. Last week, the WG7 completed a very productive face-to-face meeting here in the D.C. metro area with input submitted by various subworking groups and members. The input did range from very raw data to structured information, so it is still being reviewed. I want to thank the CSRIC members for their support of the member participation at that meeting. Another action from that face-to-face is while we were broken out into sub-working groups 3, at this point we are combining back to a single group and we'll be completing the rest of the report and appendixes as a single group. This afternoon when we begin reviewing those inputs in more detail and start to compile the draft final report. We are currently on schedule with the WG according to the Working Group 7 work plan created last spring, and or in late spring, and which is in alignment with the steering committee timeline. And to summarize that, right now, October, we are to complete the inputs and review and consolidate, and hopefully by the end of the October time frame, we'll be reviewing that as a consolidated document to make any final edits, make it a very streamlined document. November, Working Group 7 will finish the review, and it will be submitted to the steering committee November 10th, with a final report due to CSRIC November 22nd, with the readout by Jerry and myself, with hopeful acceptance by CSRIC later this year. At this time, issues. There was talk late last week about to crunch the timeline by a couple of weeks and get a consolidated report out now, but that is not going to happen, and we need to go back to the original work plan, which is still on schedule. And I just want to provide that as a heads up to anyone. There might be one or two members who are going to be upset about that, but I am available to discuss. And unless there are any questions, that concludes my report for today.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, comments about this report out from Work Group 7? Okay, thank you.
All right, we're down to the last working group, Working Group 8, ISP Network Best Practices, and that'll be presented by Dick Lynch. Dick?
Actually, Bill, no, John Morris is going to do that.
Oh, okay.
So this is this. So the brief report on Working Group 8, we're continuing to make very good progress. We had our second full working group face-to-face meeting in September, and the working group has ramped up over the last 6 weeks from biweekly meetings to weekly phone calls, and we are very, very close. We're expecting by next week to have a full final draft, a full initial draft of the best practices. We've started our vetting process with stakeholder groups. Yesterday I spoke at the national meeting of MOG, one of the leading groups focused on botnets and ISP responses to botnets. So we're very much on track and expect that that we will really finalize our report in November. So and that's really the report.
Great. Any questions or comments for Working Group 8? Well, that brings us pretty close to the end of the agenda. I think it's a major milestone. Today we've gotten 3 of 10 reports voted out. In December we'll get 3 more, and then the final 4 will be voted out in March. So I think this is a significant milestone for this group, and I thank everyone for the work that has gone into getting all this progress and getting this material covered. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
I would echo Bill's comments. This is a significant amount of work. I think the reports were high quality, and looking forward to the rest of them. Just a reminder, our next meeting is the 13th of December. So we'll be getting some more reports at that time. And Jamie, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
Well, no, but since you asked, I was so impressed with the quality of work and obviously the tremendous amount of work that is going on. Thank you so much for that. I think it is obviously paying off. So thank you again for being here and for all the work that's gone into to this work.
Perfect timing. Hopefully you all are able to tell from the talks that were given today how relevant all of the work that was talked about today is, how directly relevant it is to the things that we're doing here right now. And I hope there's no doubt about that. So if you have a question about that, you should call me, because I'll be happy to talk to you in detail about that. But we will use this work, and I can tell you exactly how. So it's very important to us. Thank you. I know how hard you all are working, and I personally appreciate it. I know as an organization we do. Next time we see each other, holiday season will be around the corner. So looking forward to seeing you at the holiday season in the nation's capital. And in the meantime, have a safe trip home, and farewell.
Big CSRIC holiday party.